A millionaire gave a dress to a homeless black woman and took her as his date to his ex-wife's wedding. Upon entering the ceremony, she revealed something shocking. The autumn sun bathed the facade of St. Peter's Cathedral in a golden glow as an elegant crowd gathered on its marble steps. The excited buzz grew with each arrival of guests in luxury cars, all eager to witness what promised to be the social event of the year, the wedding of Laura Blackwell, heiress to one of the city's most influential families, to billionaire Marcus Johnson. Among the guests, Sarah Johnson, Marcus's sister, was nervously adjusting the pearl necklace around her neck. Her restless green eyes scanned the crowd in search of her brother. "Where the hell is he?" she muttered to herself, checking her wristwatch for the 10th time in the last 5 minutes. Jake Morrison, Marcus's best friend and best man at the wedding, approached Sarah, offering her a glass of champagne. "Relax, Sarah. Your brother has never been late for anything in his life. He'll turn up." Sarah accepted the drink with a tense smile. "It's not the lateness that worries me, Jake. It's something else." She hesitated, her eyes meeting Jake's for a moment before looking away. Jake frowned, puzzled. "What do you mean?" Before Sarah could answer, a murmur of surprise went through the crowd. All eyes turned to the street, where a black limousine had just pulled up. The door opened and Marcus Johnson emerged, impeccable in his tuxedo. But it wasn't his appearance that caused the collective shock. It was his companion. Next to Marcus, arm in arm with him, was a woman no one recognized. Her curly black hair was tied up in a simple bun, and she wore a navy blue dress that, although elegant, seemed out of place among the gala outfits of the other guests. But what really caught the eye was the way she carried herself, with a mixture of discomfort and determination. Sarah felt the air escape from her lungs. "It can't be," she whispered, instinctively squeezing Jake's arm. Jake, confused, looked from Sarah to the approaching couple. "Who is she?" "Ebony Smith," Sarah replied, her voice barely audible. "The beggar girl who used to hang around the corner from Marcus's office." The revelation dropped like a bombshell on Jake. He watched, stunned, as Marcus and Ebony climbed the church steps, ignoring the shocked looks and whispers that followed them. Inside the cathedral, the atmosphere was one of palpable tension. The guests settled into their seats, but everyone's eyes were fixed on Marcus and his mysterious escort. Laura, the bride, had not yet arrived, but the news of Ebony's presence had certainly reached her ears. Marcus guided Ebony to the first bench, next to her parents. Mr. and Mrs. Johnson looked petrified, unable to disguise their shock and disapproval. Marcus leaned over and whispered something in his mother's ear before heading towards the altar, where the priest was waiting for him with a barely concealed expression of confusion. Sarah and Jake hurried to catch up with Marcus. "What are you thinking?" Sarah hissed, grabbing her brother's arm. "Have you lost your mind?" Marcus looked at his sister with surprising calm. "Trust me, Sarah. There's more to this story than you realize." "But Marcus," Jake interjected, "it's your wedding. How could you bring her?" Marcus stared at his friend with an intensity Jake had never seen before. "Ebony has every right to be here. In fact, she's the reason we're all here today." Before Sarah or Jake could question further, the wedding march began to play. The cathedral doors opened, revealing Laura Blackwell, radiant in her wedding dress. For a moment, everything seemed normal. The beautiful bride, the groom waiting at the altar, the guests standing in respect. But as Laura walked down the aisle, her eyes met Ebony's. Something passed between the two women, a look of recognition, perhaps even understanding. Laura hesitated for a moment, almost imperceptibly, before continuing her walk down the aisle. When Laura finally reached Marcus' side, the priest began the ceremony. but the words about love and commitment seemed to echo strangely in the charged atmosphere of the cathedral. It was when it came to the vows that everything changed. Marcus turned to face Laura, but his eyes flicked briefly to Ebony. He took a deep breath and began, "Laura, when we first met." But he couldn't finish. Sarah, unable to contain herself any longer, stepped forward. "Stop!" Her voice echoed through the cathedral. "This isn't right. We can't go on with this farce." A stunned silence fell over the assembly. All eyes turned to Sarah, who was visibly shaking, but holding her ground. "Sarah, what are you doing?" Jake whispered, trying to pull her back. But Sarah disentangled herself from him. "No, Jake. They need to know the truth." She turned to the shocked congregation. "Marcus can't marry Laura. Not when the real story between him and Ebony comes out." Marcus closed his eyes, as if preparing for a blow. Laura looked from Marcus to Ebony, her expression a mixture of confusion and growing understanding. Ebony, for her part, stood up slowly. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft but clear, carrying a strength that no one expected. "Maybe it's time everyone knew the truth. About the accident, about our families, about everything." The buzz grew in the cathedral. Mr. Johnson stood up abruptly, his face red with anger. "Marcus, what's going on here?" Marcus looked at his father, then at Laura, and finally at Ebony. At that moment, it felt like the weight of the world was on his shoulders. He took a step forward, his voice trembling slightly as he began to speak. 10 years ago, there was an accident. An accident that changed many lives, including mine and Ebony's. It's a story that I've tried to bury, that we've all tried to forget. But today is the day that the truth needs to come out. As Marcus began to unravel the story that had been hidden for so long, the tension in the cathedral was palpable. What had begun as a fairy tale wedding was about to turn into something very different. A journey of revelations, redemption, and perhaps a new kind of love. The silence that followed Marcus' words was thick, almost palpable. The guests, still stunned, waited with a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity. Laura, the bride, stood motionless next to Marcus, her eyes fixed on him, searching his tense face for answers. Ebony Smith stepped forward, her presence suddenly much more noticeable than when she had entered the church. She looked at Marcus, a silent understanding passing between them, before turning to the congregation. "Perhaps," she began, her voice surprisingly firm, "I should start this story. After all, it was my family that suffered the hardest blow that fateful night." Sarah Johnson, still standing near the altar, seemed about to intervene again, but Jake held her gently by the arm, whispering, "Let her speak, Sarah. It's time for the truth to come out." Ebony took a deep breath and began her narrative. 10 years ago, I was a young girl full of dreams, about to start college. My parents had saved all their lives to give me this opportunity. That night, we were coming back from a celebration. Her voice shook slightly, but she pulled herself together. That's when a speeding car hit ours. The impact was devastating. When I woke up in hospital a few days later, I found out that my parents hadn't survived. A murmur of sympathy ran through the church. Even those who had looked down on Ebony moments before now regarded her with a mixture of pity and respect. "The driver of the other car," Ebony continued, her eyes turning to the Johnson family, "was Henry Johnson, Marcus's father. Mr. Johnson, who until then had looked furious, visibly paled. His wife let out a small moan, clinging to her husband's arm for support." Marcus stepped forward to stand beside Ebony. "My father was coming back from a company party. He'd had too much to drink, but he insisted on driving. The accident destroyed many lives that night. Laura, who had remained silent until then, finally found her voice. "Marcus, why didn't you ever tell me about this?" The pain in Marcus' eyes was evident as he turned to her. "I wanted to, Laura. So many times I wanted to. But the shame, the fear of losing everything, they silenced me." Ebony continued her story, her voice now charged with emotion. "After the accident, I lost everything. College, our home, my hopes for the future. I spiraled into depression and ended up on the streets." The eyes of everyone present were fixed on Ebony, many of them brimming with tears. The transformation of the beggar into a woman with such a tragic story was palpable. "It was a few months ago," Ebony continued, "that Marcus recognized me on the corner of his office. He stopped, looked at me, and I saw the recognition in his eyes. At that moment, all the past came rushing back like an avalanche." Marcus nodded, taking the floor. "When I saw Ebony, I realized that I could no longer run away from the past. I started helping her, trying in some way to make up for what my family had done." Sarah, unable to contain herself, interrupted. "But why bring her here today, Marcus? Why ruin your marriage?" Marcus looked at his sister with a mixture of sadness and determination. "Because I can't start a new life based on lies. Sarah, Laura, all of you, deserve to know the truth." Laura, who had remained silent, stepped forward. Her eyes met Ebony's, and for a moment, a silent understanding seemed to pass between the two women. "Ebony," Laura began, her voice soft, "I'm sorry for what you've been through. No one should have to suffer like that." She turned to Marcus, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "And you, Marcus, why didn't you trust me to share this burden?" Mr. Johnson, who until then had remained in shock, finally stood up. His face was pale, but his voice was firm as he spoke. "It's my fault. I begged Marcus to keep it a secret. I thought I could protect our family, our reputation. But now I see that I've only caused more pain." Mrs. Johnson sobbed softly, hiding her face in her hands. The weight of the truth seemed to crush everyone in the church. Jake, who had been watching everything in silence, stepped forward. "Maybe," he said, looking around, "this is a moment not just of revelation, but of redemption, of healing." His words seemed to break the spell of shock that had fallen over the congregation. People began to move, to whisper among themselves. Some cast looks of sympathy at Ebony, others of confusion at Marcus and Laura. The priest, who had remained silent throughout the revelation, finally spoke. "My children, it seems that God has brought us here today not for a wedding, but for something equally sacred: the search for truth and forgiveness." Ebony looked at the priest, then at Marcus and Laura. "I didn't come here to ruin anything," she said softly. "I just wanted closure, to understand, and maybe, finally, move on." Marcus nodded, turning to Laura. "I love you, Laura, but I can't ask you to marry me based on lies. You deserve the truth. You deserve to choose with all the facts in hand." Laura looked from Marcus to Ebony, then to the stunned congregation. Her wedding dress, once a symbol of joy and expectation, now seemed heavy, almost suffocating. She began, her voice trembling slightly. "I need time to think, to process all this." Sarah, who had been silent for a while, finally spoke. "I think we all do. This is too much to take in at once." Mr. Johnson stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Ebony. "Miss Smith," he said, his voice heavy with emotion, There are no words that can adequately express my regret. But if you'll allow me, I'd like to try to make things right. For you. For your family." Ebony looked at the man who had indirectly changed the course of her life. There was pain in his eyes, but also a spark of something else, perhaps hope, perhaps the beginnings of forgiveness. Marcus looked around at the shocked, confused, and emotional faces. "I think," he said slowly, "that this is no longer a wedding day. But perhaps it can be the start of something just as important. Healing, truth, and, who knows, redemption." As the guests began to rise, murmuring amongst themselves, it became clear that the day had taken a turn that no one could have predicted. Marcus and Laura's wedding would not take place, at least not today. But that afternoon's revelations had planted the seeds for something new, something that could, with time and care, blossom into something beautiful and true. As people began to leave the church, the air was filled not only with shock and confusion, but also with a strange sense of possibility. The future, once so clearly defined, was now a blank canvas, ready to be painted with the colors of truth and reconciliation. The afternoon sun was already slanting towards the horizon as the last guests left St. Peter's Cathedral. What should have been a celebration of love had turned into a whirlwind of emotions and revelations. In the church hall, Marcus Johnson stood motionless, his gaze lost in the distance, while around him, a small group of people, those most directly affected by the day's events, gathered in a tension-filled silence. Laura Blackwell, still in her wedding dress, was sitting on a nearby bench, her eyes red with tears. Ebony Smith, the woman whose presence had triggered the whole series of events, stood a little apart, as if unsure of her place in the scene. It was Sarah, Marcus' sister, who finally broke the oppressive silence. "What now?" she asked, her voice echoing in the empty space of the church. "What do we do with all this?" Marcus turned to face her, exhaustion evident in every line of his face. "Honestly, Sarah, I don't know." Jake Morrison, who had remained by Sarah's side throughout the commotion, stepped forward. "Maybe," he suggested carefully, "we should all sit down and talk. Calmly. There's a lot to be discussed." Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, who until then had remained in stunned silence, exchanged a glance. Mr. Johnson snorted, his voice hoarse as he spoke. "I think we owe it to everyone, especially to you, Miss Smith." Ebony looked up, surprised at being directly addressed. She nodded slowly, her voice soft but firm. "Yes, I think a conversation is necessary." Laura stood up abruptly, attracting all eyes. I need a moment," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Without waiting for an answer, she turned and walked quickly to one of the church's side chapels. Marcus tried to follow her, but Sarah stopped him with a gentle touch on his arm. "Leave her, Marcus. She needs space." The group gathered in a small room adjacent to the main nave, normally used for parish meetings. The contrast between the welcoming atmosphere and the palpable tension between them couldn't have been more obvious. Marcus was the first to speak, his voice charged with emotion. "I want to apologize to everyone. The way I did it, it wasn't fair to anyone." "It really wasn't," Sarah replied, a touch of irritation in her voice. "Marcus, how could you keep this secret for so long? From all of us." Marcus ran a hand over his face, the weight of guilt evident on his shoulders. At first, it was out of fear of destroying our family, our reputation. Then, it became easier to pretend that nothing had happened. Mr. Johnson intervened, his voice trembling. "It's my fault, son. I begged you to keep it a secret. I thought I was protecting all of us, but now I see that I've only caused more pain." Ebony, who had remained silent until then, finally spoke. For years, I blamed your family for everything I lost. My parents, my future. Everything seemed to have been ripped away from me that night. The room fell silent, the weight of Ebony's words hanging over everyone. Mrs. Johnson sobbed softly, tears running freely down her face. But, Ebony continued, her voice gaining strength, over time, I realized that carrying all this resentment was destroying me as much as the accident. When Marcus found me, it was like the universe was giving me a chance to finally face the past. Jake, who had been watching everything with a thoughtful expression, said, "Sometimes fate works in mysterious ways. Maybe this meeting was necessary for all of us." Sarah cast a penetrating glance at Jake, as if seeing him in a new light. There was something about his calm and wisdom that intrigued her. Marcus stood up and walked over to the window. The setting sun cast long shadows through the glass, painting the room in shades of orange and red. "I love Laura," he said softly, "but now I realize that I couldn't have built a future with her based on lies." As if summoned by his words, the door opened and Laura walked in. Her eyes were red, but there was a determination in her gaze that hadn't been there before. "I heard," she said, her voice surprisingly firm, "and I think I understand now, Marcus, why you did what you did today." Marcus turned to face her, the surprise evident on his face. "Laura, She held up a hand, gently silencing him. "Don't say anything yet. I've spent the last hour thinking, reflecting on everything that's happened, and I've come to a conclusion." Everyone in the room held their breath, waiting for Laura's next words. "What we had, Marcus, was beautiful, but it was based on an incomplete version of you, of us. And now I don't know if I can just ignore all that and move on as if nothing had happened." Marcus nodded slowly, the pain evident in his eyes, but also a touch of relief. "I understand, Laura, and I respect your decision." Laura turned to Ebony, surprising everyone. "Ebony, I'm sorry for what you've been through. No one deserves to suffer so much." Ebony seemed momentarily speechless, touched by Laura's unexpected empathy. "Thank you," she finally managed to say. "That means a lot." Mr. Johnson stood up, his posture erect despite the visible weight on his shoulders. "Miss Smith, I know that nothing I can say or do will ever make up for what you've lost. But if you'll allow me, I'd like to try to make things right, not just with money, but with concrete actions to honor the memory of your parents." Ebony looked at the man, years of anger and resentment mingling with a new understanding. I appreciate that, Mr. Johnson. Maybe it's time we all tried to heal those old wounds." Sarah, who had been quiet for a while, finally spoke. "I think we all have a lot to process. But maybe this is the start of something new, something more honest." Jake nodded, a small smile forming on his lips. "Sometimes it takes everything falling apart for us to rebuild something stronger." As night fell outside, the group continued to talk, tears being shed, apologies offered, and, slowly, the first hesitant steps towards healing being taken. When they finally left the church hours later, the world looked different. The wedding that was supposed to take place that day hadn't happened, but something just as profound had occurred. Long-buried secrets had been brought to light, and with them, the possibility of redemption and a new beginning. Marcus, the last to leave, stood on the steps of the church, looking up at the starry sky above. The weight on his heart, carried for so many years, seemed a little lighter. The future, once so clearly defined, was now an unknown. But for the first time in a long time, he felt truly free. With one last look at the cathedral that had witnessed so many revelations, Marcus descended the steps, ready to face whatever fate had in store for him. The truth had been revealed, and now, finally, the healing could begin. A week had passed since the fateful day in St. Peter's Cathedral. The city buzzed with rumors and speculation about the wedding that didn't take place, but for those directly involved, time seemed to have slowed down, each day a struggle to process the events and their consequences. Marcus Johnson was sitting in his office on the roof of one of the city's most imposing skyscrapers. The morning sun flooded the room through the floor-to-ceiling windows, but not even the golden warmth could dispel the haze of melancholy that enveloped him. His fingers drummed restlessly on a leather folder on the table in front of him. Inside were documents that could change many lives, including his own. He was about to make a decision that, just a few weeks ago, would have seemed unthinkable. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called, straightening up in his chair. Sarah entered, her heels echoing on the marble floor. She looked tired, with slight dark circles under her eyes, but there was a determination in her gaze that Marcus recognized immediately. "Are you sure about this, Marcus?" she asked without preamble, indicating the briefcase with a nod. Marcus sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Honestly, no, but I feel it's the right thing to do." Sarah sat down in the chair in front of the desk, her eyes fixed on her brother. "Transferring 30% of the company's shares to a trust in Ebony's name. It's a huge decision. The board will go crazy." "I know," Marcus replied, his voice firm. "But after everything that's happened, after everything our family has taken from her, it's the least I can do." A heavy silence fell between the brothers. Sarah watched Marcus for a long moment before speaking again, her voice softer this time. "How are you coping with all this?" "With Laura, I mean..." The mention of Laura's name made Marcus visibly cringe. She asked for some time, to think, to process everything. I don't blame her. Sarah nodded understandingly. "And Ebony? Have you spoken to her since?" "No," Marcus admitted, the guilt evident in his voice. "I wish I had all this." He gestured to the folder, organized before I got in touch. "But I think I'm also afraid." "Afraid of what?" Sarah pressed gently. Marcus hesitated, searching for the right words. "That, even after all this, she'll still only see me as the son of the man who ruined her life." Just then, the phone on Marcus' desk rang, making them both jump. Marcus answered it, listening for a moment before thanking him and hanging up. "That was reception," he informed Sarah, getting up. "Jake's here." Minutes later, Jake entered the office, his usual easy smile replaced by an expression of concern. "Marcus, Sarah," he greeted, closing the door behind him. "We've got a problem." Marcus frowned, gesturing for Jake to sit down. "What happened?" Jake took a deep breath before continuing. "It's about Ebony. She's disappeared." The news dropped like a bombshell in the office. Marcus stood up abruptly, his hands clenched into fists. "What do you mean, disappeared? Since when?" 3 days ago, Jake replied, the concern evident in his voice. "I've been keeping in touch with her, checking up on her. But for 3 days she hasn't answered my calls. She hasn't answered any messages. I went to the apartment you rented for her, and it's empty." Sarah put a comforting hand on Marcus' arm, who had started pacing back and forth. "Calm down. Let's think about this clearly. Maybe she just needs some time, like Laura." Marcus shook his head vehemently. "No, something's wrong. I can feel it. Jake, have you checked hospitals, police stations?" Jake nodded. "I made a few discreet calls. Nothing." Marcus turned to the window, his mind racing with possibilities. What if What if someone found out about the fund I'm setting up for her? What if she's in danger because of it? Sarah exchanged a worried glance with Jake. Marcus, let's not jump to conclusions. Maybe... But Marcus was already in action, reaching for his phone. I'll hire private investigators. The best ones. We need to find her. While Marcus was on the phone, Sarah approached Jake. There's something you're not telling us, she whispered, her eyes scrutinizing his face. Jake hesitated for a moment before nodding almost imperceptibly. The last time I spoke to Ebony, she mentioned something about finally facing her demons. She said there were things from her past that she needed to sort out. Sarah frowned. What kind of things? I'm not sure, Jake admitted. But her tone. Sarah. She sounded scared. Across the room, Marcus was finishing his call. He turned to the other two, determination burning in his eyes. The investigators will start immediately. But I'm not going to stand by and wait. I'll look for her myself if I have to. Sarah stepped forward to stand beside her brother. Not alone. I'm with you. Jake stood up, joining them. Count me in too. We'll find her. As the three of them began to draw up a plan of action, the sun outside began to be overcast by dark clouds, as if the sky itself reflected the storm brewing in their lives. On Marcus's desk, the folder with the documents from the fund for Ebony remained closed, a silent reminder of how much was still at stake. The past, which everyone thought they had finally faced, seemed to be casting its shadow over the present once again. Meanwhile, somewhere in the city, Ebony Smith was facing her own demons, alone and scared, unaware that 3 people were about to turn the city upside down to find her. The search for Ebony wasn't just a rescue mission. It was a journey of redemption, a chance for Marcus, Sarah, and Jake to prove to themselves and each other that the past wouldn't define their future. And as they prepared to leave the office, each of them felt, in a different way, that the next few days would change their lives forever. The distant sound of thunder echoed through the city, as if announcing the start of a new storm, not just in the sky, but in the lives of those who had been united by fate and the secrets of the past. The rain fell incessantly on the city, turning the streets into turbulent rivers and soaking to the bone those who ventured out. On the 3rd day of the search for Ebony, Marcus Johnson was standing in front of a fogged-up window in a decaying motel on the outskirts of the city, his figure reflected in the glass blending in with the shadows of the dimly lit room behind him. Sarah entered the room, shaking a soaked umbrella. Nothing yet, she said, frustration evident in her voice. It's as if she's vanished into thin air. Marcus turned around, his tired eyes and unshaven beard giving him an appearance that contrasted sharply with his usual polished image as a successful businessman. There must be something we're missing, he muttered, more to himself than to Sarah. Jake, who was sitting at the small table in the bedroom, surrounded by papers and an open laptop, looked up. Maybe, he began hesitantly, maybe we're looking in the wrong place. Sarah approached, curious. What do you mean? Jake turned the laptop so that the siblings could see the screen. I've been researching more about Ebony's past, before the accident. Look at this. On the screen, an old photo showed a young Ebony, smiling next to a group of children in front of a worn-out building with a sign that read, Home of Hope. Marcus leaned in, frowning. An orphanage. Jake nodded. Apparently, Ebony spent a few years there before being adopted by the Smiths. And guess what? The place still exists, about 2 hours from here. Sarah exchanged a look with Marcus. Do you think she might have gone there? It's a possibility, Jake replied. If she's looking for answers about her past, it might be a good place to start. Marcus was already reaching for his coat. Then that's where we're going. The journey was tense. with the rain making visibility difficult on the winding road that led out of town. Sarah, in the passenger seat, kept her eyes fixed on the GPS, while Jake, in the back seat, continued his research on his laptop. "There's something else," Jake said, breaking the tense silence. "I found records of a fire at the orphanage about 15 years ago. Several injured, a few deaths." Marcus gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Was Ebony there when it happened?" Jake hesitated before answering. "Yes, she was. In fact, according to the records, she was the one who raised the alarm. She saved a lot of lives that night." Sarah turned to look at Jake, an expression of understanding appearing on her face. The demons she mentioned, that could be what she meant. The next few hours passed in a blur of wet roads and whispered conversations, each of the three lost in their own thoughts about what they might find. When they finally arrived at the Home of Hope, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over the old brick building. The place looked smaller and more worn than in the photo, but there were still signs of life, a few illuminated windows and the distant sound of children's voices. An elderly woman greeted them at the door, her tired but kind eyes scanning the three of them curiously. "Can I help you?" Marcus stepped forward. "We're looking for Ebony Smith. She may have come here recently." The woman's expression changed, a mixture of recognition and concern crossing her face. "Ebony. Yes, she was here. She arrived a few days ago, looking quite upset, but she left last night." Sarah felt her heart sink. "Do you know where she went?" The woman shook her head. "I didn't, but..." She hesitated, looking at the three of them. "She spent a lot of time in her old room. She left some things there. Perhaps you'd like to take a look." Following the woman through the narrow corridors of the orphanage, Marcus couldn't help but notice the curious stares of the children peering through the ajar doors. The place exuded a mixture of hope and sadness that squeezed his heart. The room was small, with 2 single beds and a worn desk. On the table, an open notebook and some scattered papers. Jake was the first to approach, his eyes roaming over the pages of the notebook. Their memories. Things she remembers from her childhood here. Sarah picked up one of the loose sheets, her eyes widening as she read the contents. "Marcus, look at this." Marcus took the paper, feeling a lump form in his throat as he read. "Dear Mr. Johnson, I know you'll probably never read this, but I need to put it into words. For years, I hated you for what happened to my adoptive parents. But being back here, remembering where I came from, has made me realize something. The tragedy that brought us together didn't start that night of the accident. It started much earlier, with choices and circumstances that were beyond our control. I can't carry this hatred any longer. I need to find a way forward, to peace. And to do that, I need to face the past one last time. Ebony." Marcus felt tears burn his eyes. She's looking for forgiveness. Not just for me or my father, but for herself." Jake, who had been examining the other papers, caught the others' attention. "I think I know where she might have gone. There are notes here about a nearby lake. Apparently, that's where the children from the orphanage used to go in the summer." Sarah was already heading for the door. "So that's where we're going." Night had completely fallen by the time they reached the lake. The rain had finally stopped, leaving behind a damp, heavy air. In the light of the car's headlights, they saw a lone figure sitting on a wooden pier, his feet dangling over the dark water. Marcus felt his heart leap. "Ebony," he murmured. Slowly, the three of them approached the pier. Ebony didn't turn around, but her voice, low and tired, reached them. "I knew you'd find me eventually. Marcus took another step forward, stopping beside her. Ebony, we were worried. She finally looked up, her eyes meeting Marcus. I needed to do this on my own, Marcus. Understand where I came from, who I really am. Sarah knelt down beside Ebony. And did you find what you were looking for? A small smile formed on Ebony's lips. I think I did. Or at least, I've started to. Jake joined them, taking a seat on the other side. You scared us, you know that. Ebony looked at each of them, the surprise evident on her face. You really care, don't you? Marcus sat down next to her, his eyes fixed on the dark horizon. More than you know, Ebony. More than any of us imagined. For a long moment, the four of them sat there in silence, the gentle sound of the water lapping against the pier, the only noise around. It was as if the world had stopped, giving them this moment of peace and mutual understanding. Finally, Ebony spoke again, her voice laden with emotion. I thought that by coming back here, reliving everything, I could finally leave the past behind. But now I realize that it's not about leaving it behind. It's about accepting, about integrating all the parts of who I am. Marcus gently placed a hand on hers. And who you are, Ebony, is someone incredible. Someone who, despite everything, still has the courage to seek truth and forgiveness. Sarah nodded, tears shining in her eyes. You've taught us more about strength and resilience in these few days than we could have learned in a lifetime. Jake smiled softly. And you've shown us that family isn't just about blood. It's about connection, about being there for each other, no matter what. Ebony looked at each of them, feeling a warmth spread through her chest for the first time in a long time. Thank you, she whispered, for finding me, for not giving up. Marcus stood up, holding out his hand to her. Let's go home, Ebony, all of us. As they walked back to the car, the sky began to lighten, the first lights of dawn painting the horizon in soft shades of pink and orange. It was as if nature itself was celebrating this new beginning, this unlikely family forged through pain, truth, and, finally, forgiveness. And so, as the sun rose over the lake, illuminating the path ahead, Marcus, Sarah, Jake, and Ebony left behind the shadows of the past, ready to face together whatever the future held for them. The morning sun bathed the meeting room at the top of the Johnson Enterprises building in golden light, contrasting with the tense atmosphere that hung in the air. Marcus Johnson stood in front of the window, his hands in his pockets, as the board members entered one by one, casting curious and apprehensive glances in his direction. Sarah, seated at the oval mahogany table, exchanged a meaningful glance with Jake, who was standing next to her. They both knew what was coming, and the impact it would have not only on the business, but on their personal lives. When everyone was seated, Marcus turned around, his face a mask of determination. Ladies and gentlemen of the board, thank you for attending this emergency meeting. I have an important announcement to make. He paused, his eyes scanning the room before continuing. I have decided to transfer 30% of my shares in the company to a charitable trust in Ebony Smith's name. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of someone choking on their coffee. Then, like a dam bursting, the room erupted in excited voices. "This is absurd!" shouted one of the oldest members of the council. "You can't just give a third of the company to a stranger." Another member, a middle-aged woman with heavy-framed glasses, leaned forward. "Marcus, think about it. This could destabilize the entire structure of the company. The shareholders will go crazy." Marcus raised his hand, silencing everyone. "My decision is made. The fund will be managed by an independent board, with the aim of supporting causes that Miss Smith considers important. This includes, but is not limited to, support for orphans and victims of traffic accidents. Sarah stood up, her firm voice cutting through the hubbub that had started up again. As Executive Vice President, I fully support Marcus' decision. This is an opportunity for Johnson Enterprises not only to do the right thing, but also to position itself as a company that values social responsibility. Jake, surprising everyone, including himself, also spoke out. As the company's legal advisor, I can assure you that all legal aspects of this transfer have been carefully considered. There are no legal impediments to this action. The meeting went on for hours, with heated arguments from both sides. But in the end, it was clear that Marcus' decision was irrevocable. As the council members began to leave, some still muttering in disapproval, others looking thoughtful, Marcus felt a weight being lifted from his shoulders. Sarah approached her brother, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You did the right thing, Marcus. It's not going to be easy, but I'm proud of you." Jake joined them, a tired smile on his face. "Well, it's certainly going to shake things up around here, but I agree with Sarah. It was the right thing to do." Marcus looked at them both, gratitude evident in his eyes. "Thank you, both of you. I don't know if I could have done it without your support." At that moment, Marcus' phone vibrated. He looked at the screen and his face lit up. "It's Ebony. She wants to meet us in the park in an hour." The city's Central Park was full of life that sunny afternoon. Children ran and laughed on the swings, couples strolled hand in hand, and old people fed the pigeons on the benches. Amidst all this normality, Ebony Smith waited nervously near the central fountain. When she saw Marcus, Sarah, and Jake approaching, she felt a wave of contradictory emotions: gratitude, apprehension, hope. She stood up to greet them, noticing the serious expression on their faces. "Has something happened?" she asked worriedly. Marcus exchanged a glance with the others before answering. "Ebony, there's something we need to tell you." Over the next few minutes, Marcus explained about the fund, the transfer of shares, and what it meant. Ebony listened in shock, her eyes growing wider and wider. "Marcus, I can't accept this," she finally managed to say. "It's too much. You've already done so much for me." Sarah stepped forward, taking Ebony's hands in her own. "It's not just about you, Ebony. It's about doing the right thing, about using the resources we have to make a difference." Jake nodded, adding, "Think of all the lives you can impact with this, all the children who can have a second chance. Like you did." Ebony looked at each of them, tears forming in her eyes. "I don't know what to say. It's incredible, but also scary. What if I'm not up to this responsibility?" Marcus smiled gently. "You're not alone in this, Ebony. We'll be by your side, helping and guiding you. This is our way of saying that you're part of the family now." Marcus' carved words touched Ebony deeply. Family. It was something she had lost for so long, and now, unexpectedly, found again. "Thank you," she whispered, hugging each of them. "I promise to do my best to honor that trust." As they talked about the next steps and the possibilities that lay ahead, they were interrupted by a familiar voice. "Marcus!" Everyone turned to see Laura standing there, looking surprised and a little uncomfortable. Marcus stepped forward, hesitantly. "Laura, She held up her hand, interrupting him. "No, please, I heard about what you did. The donation, the fund. It's incredible, Marcus." Ebony watched the interaction, feeling suddenly out of place. But Laura turned to her, a small smile on her lips. "Ebony, isn't it? I wanted to tell you. I'm glad you've found a place. And that Marcus, that you've all found a way forward." Sarah, sensing the tension in the air, suggested, Why don't we all sit down? I think we have a lot to talk about." And so, on that sunny afternoon in the park, an unlikely group came together. Marcus, Sarah, Jake, Ebony, and Laura, each carrying their own baggage of experiences and emotions, but all united by the search for understanding and reconciliation. As they talked, laughed, and sometimes cried together, it was clear that something new was being born there. It wasn't the happy ending of a fairy tale, with all the wounds magically healed. It was something more real, more profound. It was the beginning of a journey of healing, forgiveness, and new beginnings. Laura, observing the dynamic between Marcus and Ebony, felt a twinge of sadness, but also of acceptance. She realized that sometimes love doesn't go the way we expect, but that doesn't make it any less valuable. Jake and Sarah, sitting side by side, exchanged glances full of new understanding. The trials of the last few days had revealed feelings that they both barely knew existed, and Marcus, looking at the assembled group, felt a sense of peace that he hadn't experienced for years. The weight of the secrets and guilt he had carried for so long was finally beginning to dissipate. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the group said goodbye, each going their separate ways, but all knowing that their lives were now irrevocably intertwined. Ebony was the last to leave, stopping to take one last look at Marcus. "Thank you," she said simply, "for giving me a second chance at life." Marcus smiled, feeling a wave of emotion run through him. "No, Ebony, thank you for giving us all a second chance." As she walked home, Ebony reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her there. From orphan to beggar, from victim to agent of change. The future was still uncertain, full of challenges and responsibilities she could barely imagine. But for the first time in a long time, she faced it not with fear, but with hope. The sun finally set, but for Ebony, Marcus, and everyone else, it was as if a new day was just beginning. A day full of promise, new horizons, and endless possibilities. The rising sun cast golden rays over the city, illuminating the windows of the newly opened Hope Community Center. A shiny sign at the entrance announced, "Grand opening, all are welcome." Ebony Smith stood in front of the building, her heart pounding with a mixture of nervousness and excitement. 2 years had passed since that fateful day in the church, and so much had changed. The community center was the first major project of the fund Marcus had set up in her name, a dream she had hardly dared to have, and which was now coming true. "Nervous?" a familiar voice asked behind her. Ebony turned to see Marcus smiling, his eyes shining with pride. "A little," she admitted, smiling back, "but more than that, I'm grateful for everything." Marcus took her hand, interlacing their fingers. The gesture, now so familiar and comfortable, still made Ebony's heart skip a beat. "You did it, Ebony. Your vision, your dedication. I'm just happy to be able to be a part of it." Over the past 2 years, their relationship had slowly blossomed, growing from a mutual understanding to a deep connection, and finally, love. It wasn't easy. They both carried scars from the past, but together, they were learning to heal and trust again. Sarah and Jake approached, hand in hand. The couple had married 6 months earlier in an intimate ceremony at the same lake where they had met Ebony on that crucial night. "Everything's ready inside," Sarah informed them, her face radiant. Her 4-month pregnancy was barely visible under her elegant blazer. "The children from the orphanage have arrived. They're so excited." Jake nodded, adding, "And the press are in place. Everything according to plan." Ebony took a deep breath, looking at her friends, no, her family. "Let's go, then." As they walked towards the entrance, a familiar figure approached, bringing the group to a halt. "Laura?" Marcus asked, surprised. Laura Blackwell smiled. a little shyly. "I hope you don't mind me coming. I wanted to see it for myself." There was a moment of tension, but Ebony stepped forward, holding out her hand. "I'm glad you came, Laura. It means a lot." Laura accepted the gesture, her smile becoming more genuine. "You're doing something incredible here. I wanted to be a part of it. Somehow." Marcus watched the interaction with mixed emotions. There was a pain there, reminiscent of what might have been, but also a deep gratitude for the path life had taken. "Why don't you join us?" he offered. "I'm sure the children would love to meet a famous journalist." Laura laughed, the sound light and genuine. "I'd love to." The interior of the center was a vibrant and welcoming space. Classrooms equipped for tutoring, an art studio, a cozy library, and a large multi-purpose hall. Every detail had been thought out to create an environment of learning, healing, and growth. As Ebony gave her opening speech, her voice trembling slightly with emotion, she saw familiar faces in the crowd. The lady from the orphanage where she grew up, now retired, was smiling with tears in her eyes. Some of the children Ebony had met on her recent visits to the orphanage were waving cheerfully. "This center," Ebony declared, her voice gaining strength, "is more than just a building. It's a symbol of hope, of second chances, of community. It's proof that our past doesn't have to define our future. That with love, compassion, and support, we can overcome any obstacle." Her eyes met Marcus, and she smiled. "It's also a testament to the power of forgiveness and redemption, of how sometimes the greatest blessings can be born out of the greatest tragedies." After the speech, as people explored the center, Ebony found herself surrounded by a group of excited children. A small girl, no more than 6 years old, tugged on her sleeve. "Miss Ebony," she asked, eyes wide with curiosity, "is it true that you were once like us? Without a family?" Ebony knelt down, getting on the child's level. "Yes, darling. It's true. But you know what? Family isn't just about blood. It's about people who love you, who care for you, who believe in you even when you don't believe in yourself." The girl smiled, revealing a small window between her teeth. "Like Mr. Marcus." Ebony laughed, feeling her heart fill with love. "Yes, just like Mr. Marcus, and like Mrs. Sarah, and Mr. Jake, and so many other wonderful people I've met along the way." Later, when the excitement of the opening had died down, the small group, Marcus, Ebony, Sarah, Jake, and Laura, gathered on the center's terrace. The sun was setting, painting the sky in vibrant shades of orange and pink. "So," Laura asked, a smile playing on her lips, "what's next?" Ebony looked at Marcus, a silent communication passing between them. "Well," she began, "we're thinking of expanding the program, maybe opening similar centers in other cities." Jake nodded enthusiastically. "And don't forget the scholarship program we're developing." Sarah, gently stroking her belly, added, "And, of course, we have a new family member coming in a few months." Marcus smiled, looking at the assembled group. 2 years ago, if someone had told me we'd all be here, like this, I never would have believed it." Laura raised her glass in a toast. "To life and its surprises. And to doing good, no matter where we come from." Everyone raised their glasses, the clink of the glass echoing in the night air. Ebony looked at the horizon, at the city that had once rejected her and was now opening up to new possibilities. She thought of her adoptive parents, hoping that, wherever they were, they would be proud. She thought of the children downstairs, whose lives she hoped she could positively impact. And then she looked at Marcus, the man who had come into her life in such an unexpected and life-changing way. Their eyes met, and in that moment, they both knew. This wasn't an ending. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. As the stars began to dot the night sky, the group remained on the terrace, talking, laughing, and dreaming of the future. The gentle breeze carried promises of better days, of healed hearts, and of love that overcomes all barriers. And so, on a summer's night, under a starry sky, Ebony and Marcus' story, a story of loss, redemption, and unexpected love, found not an ending, but a new beginning. A beginning full of hope, endless possibilities, and the certainty that, no matter how dark the night, dawn always comes, bringing with it the promise of a new day. Did this narrative stir your emotions? Don't forget to express your approval with a like. Take advantage of the Super Thanks feature, available just below the video, to offer direct support to the channel and contribute to the production of more fascinating content. Subscribe and remember to activate the bell to stay up to date with all the latest updates. And attention, a new exciting story is already ready to be displayed on your screen. Your participation means a lot to me, and I hope to count on your presence soon. Thank you very much for dedicating your time to this video.